A sharp, ear-piercing squeal from the microphone ripped through the freezing air of the auditorium. 2,000 people stopped breathing. Up on the stage, the four-star general ignored his prepared notes. He gripped the wooden podium, his eyes cutting straight through the VIP rows. Down in the second row, my father, Frank, adjusted the collar of his flannel shirt from his velvet seat. He leaned back, pointing a calloused finger at me. I was shoved all the way against the back drywall, holding his heavy plastic cooler. "Pay attention, Mia," he whispered loudly over the crowd, his voice thick with the exhaust and grease of a Southside Chicago garage he could never wash off. That's what real greatness looks like. Not pushing papers in a basement. Keep your mouth shut and don't screw up the pictures. I didn't argue. I didn't remind him that I'd paid the mortgage on his house for 15 years. I didn't tell him about the billion-dollar budgets I approved before he even woke up to drink his cheap black coffee. I just stood there, my back straight. My breathing slowed to a measured 4-second count. I let the silence hang heavily in the room. Then the general raised his right hand. He pointed straight over my father's head. "We have a massive failure in recognition today." His voice boomed through the speakers, shaking the floorboards. "I want to acknowledge the chief architect of the Pacific." 400 heavy leather boots slammed into the wooden stage in a unified, deafening crack. Every single head in the room, the officers, the recruits, the wealthy families whipped around. They weren't looking at my brother. They weren't looking at my father. They were looking dead straight at the woman standing by the trash can in a cheap, wrinkled gray suit. My father's triumphant smile froze. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a sick ghost. His phone slipped from his thick fingers and shattered on the floor. But the absolute destruction of my father's ego didn't start in this room. The real nightmare began exactly 3 hours earlier. The motel room smelled like damp carpet, stale cigarette smoke, and cheap bleach. A lingering, suffocating scent of failure. My mother, Maria, shoved the gray linen jacket against my chest. The fabric felt rough against my palms like industrial sandpaper. She refused to look me in the eye. She just cried. It was not the quiet weeping of a broken woman. It was a calculated weapon. A blunt tool she had sharpened over 30 hard years in a Southside Chicago row house. "Don't wear the white uniform, Mia," she whispered. Her voice shook with practiced, heavy desperation. "Please, your father lost his shift at the mill. He only has his pride in Connor today. He will have a massive heart attack if he sees those stars on your shoulders." I looked down at her hands. Her wrinkled, shaking fingers gripped the lapels of my shirt, twisting the cotton fabric until her knuckles turned white. 15 years. 15 long years I had paid the heavy mortgage on that house. 15 years of quietly wiring thousands of dollars every month so they would not lose the roof over their heads. My only reward was a demand to erase my own existence. To shrink myself down into nothing just so a grown man would not feel small. I did not argue. I took the gray jacket. I slipped my arms into the tight, uncomfortable sleeves. A silent, emotional blackmail contract was signed and sealed in that miserable room. 20 minutes later, the rental Ford F-150 stank of day-old black coffee and heavy Old Spice aftershave. The salty Pacific wind whipped through a crack in the passenger window, burning my eyes with dry heat. My father, Frank, sat in the passenger seat. His thick knees were spread wide aggressively, claiming the tight space of the cabin. His jaw was locked tight, his eyes glued to the barbed wire fences of the Coronado security gates appearing in the distance. I eased my foot off the gas pedal. The heavy truck slowed down, inching toward the checkpoint. Muscle memory took over my body. My right hand slid down into my pocket. My thumb and index finger pinched the hard edge of my blue-bordered ID card, a purely mechanical motion. A dark shape flashed in my peripheral vision. My father's calloused, grease-stained hand lunged across the center console. He ripped the ID card from my grip with a sudden, violent jerk. The sharp plastic edge sliced right across my knuckle. A thin, hot line of red blood bloomed on my skin. "Put that garbage away," he growled. The sound rattled deep in his throat, thick with unchecked bitterness. "Do not pull out your little clerk badge and embarrass Connor today. The guys at the gate do not have time to look at useless papers from some glorified typist." He flicked his wrist. He threw the card down onto the black rubber floor mat. I did not slam my foot on the brakes. I did not scream at him. My brain automatically shifted into a silent crisis routine. Breathe in for 4 seconds. Hold for 4. Exhale. Down there, on the dirty floor mat, my clearance card sat abandoned. A simple piece of plastic that held the highest security clearance in the Pentagon. My father shifted his heavy weight in the seat. He dropped his right foot. The thick rubber sole of his Timberland boot, completely caked with dry gray mud, slammed directly onto the plastic card. He ground his heel right over my printed face. He turned his head away, staring out the passenger window at the ocean, his jaw still tight with misplaced anger. I shifted the gear into park. I leaned all the way over the center console, my ribs pressing painfully against the hard steering wheel. I dug my fingernail under the edge of the plastic, prying it loose from the hard ridge of his boot. I pulled the card up. It was smeared with a thick, ugly layer of dirt. I used the sleeve of my cheap gray jacket to wipe the grime away. The mud smeared across the plastic, temporarily obscuring the words, "Rear Admiral" printed in bold black ink. I shoved the card deep into the bottom of my pants pocket, letting it sit there mixed with loose pennies and pocket lint. I put the truck back in drive. We rolled up to the gate. The young guard took one look at the beat-up rental truck, glanced at the old man in the flannel shirt, and waved us right through. He did not even ask for an ID. He had no idea he just waved through a general. The massive gray steel hulls of the ships drifted past the passenger window, casting long, dark shadows over the water. That was my world. I knew the exact thickness of their outer armor. I knew the maximum reach of their tracking systems better than anyone else alive. But inside the humid cabin of the rental truck, my father began his usual exhausting sermon. Frank shifted his heavy weight, the cheap fabric of the seat groaning underneath him. He pointed a thick, calloused finger at a group of young trainees running in the distance, their shirts soaked with sweat. "Look at those guys," he said, his voice dripping with absolute worship for manual labor. "Those are real men. Sweat and dirt, not like that fragile, air-conditioned office job of yours. You just sit behind a desk all day, perfectly clean, sipping your fancy coffee, judging the guys who actually bleed for a living." In the back seat, my mother kept her mouth completely shut. Click, click, click. The steady rhythmic sound of her plastic rosary beads bumping together filled the heavy air. She stared out the window. She was praying for family peace. Her way of achieving that peace was offering me up as a silent sacrifice. The parking lot was a massive sheet of baking black asphalt. Heat waves radiated off the pavement, blurring the horizon into a watery haze. The second I turned the key in the ignition to kill the engine, my father shoved his door open and bolted out. Down the concrete walkway, my younger brother Connor stood perfectly straight in his crisp, white uniform. A solid gold pin caught the harsh California sun on his chest. "My boy!" Frank roared. The sound echoed across the lot, thick with desperate, suffocating pride. He took long, aggressive strides past the other families, grabbing Connor in a bone-crushing hug. My mother scrambled out right behind him, her purse slapping against her hip as she dabbed the corners of her eyes with a crumpled tissue. The three of them merged into a solid, unbreakable knot. a bright, shining picture of American perfection under the clear blue sky. I opened my heavy door. I stepped out onto the boiling pavement, the heat immediately seeping through the thin soles of my shoes. I stood exactly 10 paces away from them. Not a single one of them turned their head to look at me. I walked around to the dirty tailgate of the truck. Without warning, my father spun around and marched quickly toward me. He did not smile. He did not offer a greeting. He grabbed the heavy, hard plastic Yeti cooler with one hand. With the other, he snatched up a bulky canvas camera bag by its rough frayed strap. He shoved them directly into my chest with a hard thrust. I tightened my core muscles, catching the heavy cooler against my hip. The hard plastic ridge slammed brutally into my pelvic bone, sending a dull ache radiating down my leg. The camera bag swung violently, its thick strap wrapping tightly across my wrist, yanking my shoulder down with a sharp jolt. I heard the heavy ice slosh inside the cooler. "Your brother's hands are made to pull triggers and accept medals," he said. His tone was entirely hollow, devoid of any warmth or hesitation. "They are not made to carry water." He turned his back on me and started walking away. "Make yourself useful. Don't drag your feet." The dead weight hanging off my body was easily over 50 pounds. The rough nylon strap was already digging deep into my skin, cutting off the blood circulation to my left hand until my fingers tingled. 10 years ago, I would have dropped this heavy cooler right there on the hot pavement and walked away. But today, I forced my spine straight. I locked my eyes straight ahead. I dropped my shoulders and synced my breathing with the rhythm of my footsteps. I was no longer Frank's daughter. I was just the unpaid labor forced to carry the baggage for a highly toxic family outing. If you have ever been the one forced to carry the heaviest burdens for your family while being completely ignored, I know exactly how your shoulders feel right now. Drop a comment below with a simple yes if you have ever realized your family only saw you as a tool to be used. Please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so we can walk through this together. I kept walking on the burning black asphalt. I maintained my exact distance, 10 paces behind the three of them, a silent gray shadow dragging a heavy cooler following the perfect family straight toward a towering bronze statue at the end of the courtyard. I gripped the nylon strap tighter, a cold, heavy knot forming in my stomach about what would happen when it was finally time to take the pictures. The massive bronze statue towered against the bright blue sky. It was the sacred spot for every graduation photo. Frank wasted no time. He herded my mother and Connor right to the base of the heavy stone pedestal. He threw a thick, heavy arm over Connor's shoulder, puffing his chest out toward the hot sun. I dropped the dripping Yeti cooler onto the dry grass. A deep, ingrained family reflex kicked in. Without thinking, I took a step forward to join them. The hard heel of my shoe hit the edge of the concrete step. My windpipe tightened with anticipation. Suddenly, Frank swung his left arm out. The flat, calloused palm of his hand slammed hard against the center of my chest. A dead, physical stop. The raw force made me stumble. I took 2 awkward steps back. My heel caught the edge of the dirt. "Not you," Frank said. His voice was entirely cold. There was no hot anger in his tone, just a sharp, clean boundary line drawn right in the dirt. "This picture is for people who actually sacrifice blood and sweat for this country. Step out." He pointed a thick finger down at the heavy canvas bag sitting on the grass. "Get the camera out. Take the picture. That is the exact reason I let you tag along today." I stood frozen for a fraction of a second. Up on the stone pedestal, Connor looked away. He stared blankly at a distant palm tree. He was wearing a pristine white uniform that represented absolute unbreakable courage. Yet he was too much of a coward to open his mouth and defend his own sister. I did not argue. I bent down and pulled the heavy DSLR camera from the canvas bag. I lifted it to my face. The cold, hard black plastic of the viewfinder pressed painfully against my eye socket. It completely hid my expression. Looking through the glass prism, my fingers gripped the rigid barrel of the lens. I twisted the focus ring. The blurry shapes fractured, then slowly sharpened into crystal clear reality. Inside that little rectangular frame stood the perfect American family. A loud, proud old man, a quiet, weeping mother, a golden hero son. The picture was flawless. It did not need me. I was just the hired help holding the gear. I tasted the salty mix of sweat and dry dust on my lips. I pressed my index finger down. Click. The sharp mechanical snap of the shutter cut through the hot air. It severed the very last invisible string, attaching me to the people inside the frame. Frank. Hey, Frank. A loud booming voice shattered the heavy silence. Bob Miller, our loudmouth old neighbor from Ohio, swaggered over from the concrete walkway. He had 3 massive, thick-necked young trainees walking right behind him. Frank lit up. He pumped Bob's hand, immediately bragging about Connor. Bob squinted, looking past the golden boy. He stared down at me. I was still holding the heavy camera, standing alone next to the dripping cooler in my wrinkled gray jacket. Amelia Wright, Bob smirked, crossing his thick arms. Heard you were doing some big shot work up in Washington. Frank instantly waved his hand in the air, letting out a dry, mocking laugh. Big shot. Nothing like that. Frank scoffed, shaking his head. She's just a secretary. Pushes paper around, fetches coffee for the old guys down in a basement. She hates loud noises. Been scared of her own shadow since she was a little kid. The 3 young trainees looked at me, the absolute lowest guys on the food chain. Guys who had not even earned the right to speak yet. They actually sneered. One of them let out a grating, arrogant chuckle, shaking his head at the pathetic secretary. The blood in my temples throbbed, a heavy, violent pulse hammering against my skull. I had stood in the burning dirt of Kandahar, but I was not allowed to stand on the grass with my own family. I inhaled deeply, trying to grip my 4-second breathing routine, but a shadow shifted just past the edge of the dry grass. A man in a crisp khaki uniform was walking quickly down the concrete path, holding a stack of folders. 2 shiny silver bars rested on his sharp collar. A captain. He stopped dead in his tracks. He turned his head toward the loud, mocking laughter, and his eyes locked directly onto mine. Captain Miller stopped dead on the dry grass. The 3 young trainees behind my father were still chuckling, their stupid grins wide and arrogant, but Miller was not smiling. He stared directly at me. I was standing there, a heavy, wet cooler balanced on my hip, sweat drying tight on my forehead, his jaw locked. I saw the blood rush straight to his face, turning his neck a deep red. He was an aide who had walked the polished halls of Washington, D.C. with me for 3 years. He knew exactly who I was. And he could not stomach seeing his boss treated like unpaid labor. Miller snapped his boots together. He pivoted hard, marching straight toward my father and the trainees. The gap between them closed quickly. 15 yards. 10. If Miller opened his mouth, Frank would have a stroke right there on the grass. The public humiliation would kill his fragile ego, and the forced promise I made to my weeping mother would burn to ash. Miller took a deep breath. He was half a second away from barking a loud, furious order to make those boys freeze. I dropped the heavy plastic cooler onto the turf. Thud. I did not call out his name. I did not raise my hands. I just locked my eyes dead onto his pupils. A completely flat, empty stare, as sharp and cold as broken glass. I shook my head, a microscopic movement barely a single inch. Then I tapped my right index finger against my thigh. Twice. A silent, familiar signal to halt. Miller froze. His broad shoulders stiffened. He recognized the heavy, invisible authority buried under my wrinkled gray jacket. He ground his teeth together, physically swallowing the thick anger rising in his throat. He gave one sharp, almost imperceptible nod. He turned exactly 90 degrees and walked quickly away, disappearing behind a row of brick administration buildings. The bomb was diffused in total silence. 20 minutes later, thick gray charcoal smoke drifted over the outdoor picnic tables. Connor walked back from the buffet line carrying a large tray. He set a massive slab of ribs dripping with thick red barbecue sauce right in front of Frank. Connor took a huge, juicy cut of brisket for himself. My mother received a simple green salad. The only thing left on the tray was a single burnt hamburger patty. The edges were curled up and rock-hard, charred black, like a piece of dead coal. Next to it sat a small handful of stiff, cold French fries. Connor hesitated, shifting his weight, looking down at my empty hands. Frank reached out his thick, greasy arm. He shoved the paper plate with the burnt patty straight across the sticky plastic table. "Eat," Frank muttered, not even looking up from his ribs. "You type on a keyboard all day. You don't need the protein. The good meat goes to the men sweating to protect this country." I looked at the charred lump. I picked it up. I took a bite. The bitter, toxic taste of ash and cheap lighter fluid scraped violently down my dry throat. It was the taste of knowing exactly where I ranked in this family. I stood up abruptly. I shoved the greasy paper napkin into a nearby trash can. "I need to use the restroom," I said quietly. I pushed through the loud, laughing crowd and shoved open the heavy wooden door of the women's room. The sharp, stinging smell of industrial lemon cleaner hit my face. I walked straight to the porcelain sink. I cranked the cold water handle and splashed freezing water onto my face, desperately trying to wash away the boiling heat rising in my chest. Behind me, the door hinges squeaked loudly. A woman walked in. She was wearing an elegant, expensive silk dress. Laura Gallagher, the wife of the top 4-star general. Just last week, the two of us had shared a quiet, expensive dinner at a Michelin star restaurant in the capital. She stopped in her tracks. Her mouth dropped open, staring in shock at the gray, sweaty, exhausted woman leaning over the sink. "Good Lord, Mia," she gasped loudly. I instantly pressed my right index finger hard against my lips. I forced out a sharp, freezing hiss. "Shh." I pushed out of the heavy restroom door and slipped away from the loud outdoor party. I walked down a cracked concrete path leading straight toward an old, abandoned pier. The Pacific Ocean crashed violently against the rotting wooden pilings, sending a sharp, stinging spray of salt into the air. I shoved my hand deep into my pocket. My fingertips brushed past the loose pennies and found it. A tiny, hard photograph, laminated in stiff plastic, hidden right behind my driver's license. I pulled it out. The image was stained with old, dark smudges. A picture of me, lying flat on a canvas stretcher in the heavy dirt of Kandahar. The right shoulder of my uniform was cut open, wrapped tightly in dark, soaked gauze. Sitting heavily right on my chest was the silver star. That day was Thanksgiving. I had lost a half-liter of blood, dragging a guy through heavy fire. And while I was lying there waiting for the chopper, my father, Frank Perry, made an expensive long-distance call just to scream into my ear. He called me a selfish, ungrateful daughter who cared more about her job than sitting down for dry turkey in Chicago. I squeezed the tiny photograph. I gripped it so tight the hard plastic edge bit deep into my palm, leaving a sharp, stinging red line. For 16 years, I hid every single scar. I swallowed Frank's bitter insults, chewing on the toxic belief that being a good daughter meant being a punching bag. My mother used his insecurity to lock me in a cage, begging me to shrink myself down to keep him comfortable. But staying quiet did not bring peace to our house. It only fed their massive egos. Standing here today, chewing on a burnt piece of garbage and hiding from the very people who followed my lead, was not respect. It was a massive betrayal of the men and women who actually looked up to me. The sky suddenly ripped open. Boom! A massive physical shockwave slammed down onto the wooden pier. Two twin F/A 18 jets screamed across the bay at an incredibly low altitude, leaving thick, tearing trails of white smoke. The deafening roar made the regular crowd back at the picnic cover their ears and grimace. But to me, it was a language I understood perfectly. It was raw power. It was absolute unforgiving authority. The massive engines vibrated right through the soles of my shoes, traveling all the way up into my chest, shattering every remaining piece of weakness inside me. I tilted my head back. I watched the white smoke slice the clouds in half. My rapid heart rate started to slow down. Steady, flat, freezing cold. If you have ever realized that shrinking yourself down only feeds the toxic people in your life, I know exactly how that breaking point feels. Drop a comment below and tell me what was the moment you finally stopped trying to fix a family that only wanted to use you. Please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so we can keep building our strength together. I shoved the hard plastic photograph back into my wallet. The long, exhausting, emotional blackmail contract my mother forced on me was officially expired. I reached behind my neck, gathering my windblown hair, twisting it tightly into a sharp, strict bun. I grabbed the lapels of my cheap gray linen jacket, pulling the rough fabric tight. I fastened the single button right over my stomach. I was not the fragile, quiet little typist, afraid of loud noises that Frank Perry desperately needed me to be. I was the person who dictated the exact coordinates for those screaming jets in the sky. I spun on my heels. I took long, deliberate strides on the cracked concrete, walking straight back toward the massive auditorium building. Recess was officially over. It was time to clean up the mess. The massive indoor auditorium reeked of cheap industrial floor wax and the freezing blast of the heavy air conditioning units. 2,000 people were packed tightly into folding chairs. Frank marched down the center aisle with the exaggerated swagger of a man who had just won a prize fight. He herded my mother straight to the VIP section in the first 3 rows. Thick, red velvet seats reserved exclusively for the immediate families of the new grads. He dropped his heavy frame into an aisle seat. He immediately spread his knees wide, completely dominating the physical space. I walked up slowly behind them, the heavy canvas camera bag still cutting into my shoulder. There was exactly one empty red velvet seat left next to my mother. I bent my knees to sit down. Thud. Frank aggressively swung his arm out. He slammed the heavy canvas camera bag down onto the red velvet cushion right before I could sit. He took off his flannel jacket and tossed it carelessly over the strap. "This row is full," he grunted, staring straight ahead at the empty wooden stage. "The floor is too dirty, it'll ruin my camera. You can go stand in the back, lean against the wall, keep yourself out of the way so you can get a clear shot. Don't try to cram yourself in with the actual family." I looked at my mother. She immediately dropped her head. She shoved both of her hands tightly between her knees and stared at her shoes, pretending the air in the room had suddenly gone entirely deaf. I turned my back on them. I walked away from the red velvet seats. I walked up the steep incline of the carpeted aisle, moving past hundreds of staring, curious eyes. I went all the way back to the cold gray drywall at the very rear of the room. I took my place in the shadows, standing silently next to 2 broad-shouldered security guys wearing earpieces. The heavy instrumental track of the Star-Spangled Banner began to play over the speakers. The entire auditorium stood up. A sharp 20-year reflex violently jerked through my muscles. My right arm twitched, desperate, to snap up to my forehead to salute the flag I had nearly bled to death for. I ground my teeth together. I curled my trembling fingers into a tight, white-knuckled fist and buried my hand straight down along the seam of my slacks. Down in the second row, Frank puffed his chest out as far as it would go. He started belting out the anthem louder than anyone else in the building. a man who had never seen a single day of crossfire, acting like he owned the flag. He pointed a thick finger back toward me and shook his head openly, mocking me to Bob Miller standing in the next seat. The song ended. A thunderous, deafening wave of applause echoed off the drywall. General Evan Hawkins walked out onto the wooden stage. He was the top brass, a 4-star legend carrying real jagged scars under his collar. The entire room went dead silent. Down in the VIP row, Frank leaned far forward in his velvet seat. He adjusted the collar of his shirt, practically vibrating with excitement, waiting for the general to shower his son with praise. But General Hawkins did not look down at the prepared speech sitting on the podium. He gripped the wooden edges of the stand with both hands. His sharp razor-blade eyes slowly swept across the front rows. He looked right through Frank Perry's raised, arrogant chin. The 4-star general sent his gaze flying over 100 feet of empty space, right past the officers and the wealthy families. His eyes stopped. They locked dead onto the gray shadow, standing flat against the back drywall. Hawkins raised his right hand and tapped his index finger hard against the microphone. General Evan Hawkins leaned forward over the wooden podium. He completely ignored the thick stack of prepared papers sitting right in front of him. He grabbed the microphone with one large, scarred hand and pulled it close to his mouth. A sharp, piercing shriek of feedback ripped through the freezing air of the auditorium. Half the people sitting in the front rows violently flinched, covering their ears. The 4-star general did not apologize. His voice boomed through the speakers, heavy and deep, like rolling thunder. Before we pin any new badges today, I am looking at a massive failure in respect in this room. Down in the second row of the VIP section, Frank shifted eagerly in his velvet seat. He nudged his thick elbow into my mother's ribs. "Look at that Maria," he whispered, a greasy, arrogant smirk plastered across his face. "Must be some hotshot senator walking in the back doors. Sit up straight." Frank smoothed down the collar of his plaid shirt, eagerly waiting for the spotlight to hit his row. He had absolutely no idea the most powerful person in the entire building was the woman he had just banished to stand next to a trash can. Up on the stage, General Hawkins raised his right arm. He pointed a single steady finger. He pointed straight over the heads of the wealthy donors, over the top brass, straight over Frank Perry's greased back hair. The general aimed directly at the gray drywall in the very back of the room. Today, we completely failed to recognize our own leadership, Hawkins roared. The 2 heavy-set security men standing next to me automatically took one large step backward, clearing the physical space around me. "It is my absolute honor to recognize the chief architect of the Pacific," Hawkins said, his voice echoing off the walls. "Welcome ashore, Rear Admiral Mia Perry." The name dropped from the ceiling like a heavy iron anvil hitting a concrete floor. All the air was violently sucked out of the room. Frank froze. His chest stopped moving. A dry, pathetic hiccup caught in his throat. The man running the stage took a massive breath. He barked an order. It was the highest possible call to attention. Kaboom! 200 men standing on the stage, including the exact same young trainees who had just laughed in my face, and dozens of officers sitting in the front rows, shot up from their chairs in unison. 400 hard leather heels slammed down against the wooden floorboards at the exact same millisecond. The raw, physical sound vibrated right through the soles of my shoes. It traveled up my legs and rattled against my ribcage. 250 hands sliced through the freezing air, snapping sharply against their foreheads. The entire auditorium stopped looking at the stage. They all turned around. 2,000 pairs of eyes stared straight toward the back wall. Straight at the useless, pathetic typist hiding in the shadows. The massive, inflated ego of the Chicago mechanic shattered into a million tiny pieces. Frank's expensive iPhone slipped out of his thick, sweating fingers. It hit the floor, clattering loudly against the metal leg of the folding chair. He did not bend down to pick it up. His body moved like a rusted, broken machine. He slowly turned his heavy head to look back at me. His eyes were bulging, the whites completely covered in thick, red, jagged veins. All the color had drained from his face, leaving his skin looking like wet gray ash. Every single lie he had built his entire life around every pathetic excuse he used to drag me through the dirt was stripped entirely naked under the bright lights. I took one step forward. I stepped out of the heavy shadows. The harsh fluorescent lights hit my wrinkled gray linen jacket. I raised my right hand. I kept my wrist perfectly straight, returning the salute for exactly 3 seconds. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I dropped my hand to my side. "Carry on," I said quietly. 20 minutes later, the ceremony broke apart. The massive crowd parted like the Red Sea, leaving a wide, empty lane straight to the exit. Frank stumbled down the aisle, clutching his flannel jacket to his chest like a shield rushing desperately toward the parking lot. I walked slowly right behind him, preparing for the nightmare waiting inside the hot cabin of the truck. The graduation crowd did not swarm the stage like they usually did. Instead, the sea of people parted down the middle, leaving a wide, completely empty path leading straight from the wooden podium to the exit doors. I walked right down the center. Whispers echoed off the walls from the extended families and guys like Bob Miller. The loud, arrogant mocking from 20 minutes ago was entirely gone. It was replaced by a nervous, shrinking fear. My father dragged his feet far behind me. He carried the heavy Yeti cooler with both hands, his broad shoulders hunched forward. He was physically trying to shrink himself down to avoid the burning stares of everyone he had just bragged to. His heavy boots scraped against the floor like a man walking to the gallows. We walked out to the baking asphalt lot. Nobody said a single word. The heavy doors of the Ford F-150 slammed shut. Bang. The dry, hollow sound sealed the four of us inside the suffocating, sun-baked heat of the cabin. Before I even put the key in the ignition, Frank slammed his thick palm hard against the dashboard. His twisted defense mechanism kicked into high gear. He spun around in the passenger seat, his face contorted in absolute desperate denial. "You put on a real good show, Mia. You set me up," he yelled, spitting thick drops of saliva onto the center console. The thick blue veins in his neck bulged against his skin. "You purposely wore civilian clothes. You let me order you around. You kept your mouth shut just to make a total fool out of me in front of General Hawkins, didn't you?" In the back seat, my mother buried her face in her hands and started sobbing violently. "You just wanted to humiliate a working mechanic to show off your fancy Admiral title. Are you happy now?" Frank spat. I pulled my hand away from the keys. I turned my head slowly. The freezing dead air radiating from my eyes slammed right into his frantic meltdown. "I manage the nuclear budgets, Frank," I said. My voice was dangerously low, slicing straight through the heavy noise of the cabin. "I do not have the time to stage a soap opera. For 20 years you never once asked what I actually did for a living. You built this pathetic fantasy of a weak, lazy typist daughter, just to cover up the fact that you never made it past rank E5. Frank choked on his own breath, but he desperately tried to claw back his dignity. "What do you know about real blood sitting behind a desk will never make you half the man Connor is." I reached into my wallet. I pulled out the tiny, stiff, laminated photograph. I threw it hard. It hit him right in the chest and dropped onto his lap. Frank picked it up with shaking, grease-stained fingers. A picture of a woman covered in gray dirt, lying flat on a canvas stretcher. The right shoulder of her uniform was soaked in a massive, thick patch of dark blood. Pinned directly to her chest was the silver star. November 2010. I said, hitting the darkest, rotting corner of his ego. Kandahar, caught in an ambush. I took 2 rounds. I put down 3 guys to drag my guy out of the crossfire. I leaned over the center console, pushing my face inches from his. Do you remember that day Thanksgiving? You called me. You screamed through the phone that I was a selfish, ungrateful child for working instead of coming home for turkey. While you were screaming at me, I was lying in the dirt, bleeding through the gauze, waiting to see if I was going to die. Frank stared down at the date printed on the bottom corner of the plastic. His thick, heavy shoulders collapsed inward. He dropped the photograph. He buried his pale, sweaty face straight into the steering wheel. A wet, broken sob ripped out of his throat, the pathetic sound of an old man who had just killed his own soul, echoing inside the suffocating cabin. If you have ever been guilt-tripped and blamed by your own family while you were silently bleeding for them, I know exactly how heavy that betrayal feels. Drop a comment below with the word enough if you have ever been accused of not doing enough by the very people who took everything from you. Please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so we can heal from this together. I leaned my head back against the hot glass of the window, staring out into the empty parking lot. The suffocating dead silence wrapped around us, waiting for the sun to finally go down. The Denny's sat right off the edge of an empty, dark interstate highway. Above us, a dying fluorescent bulb buzzed with a loud, annoying crackle, casting a sickly yellow light down over the bright red vinyl booths. We took a corner table in the back. Connor had stripped off his pristine white uniform, replacing it with a wrinkled gray t-shirt. He kept his head down, staring blankly at the deep scratches carved into the sticky, laminate table. Frank Perry sat across from me. He was completely curled into himself, inside his old flannel shirt. The broad shoulders that used to carry 100-pound steel beams across a Chicago shop floor were now entirely collapsed. He gripped a thick, ceramic mug of steaming black coffee with both hands, staring down into the dark liquid, like he was looking into the bottomless pit of his own life. I reached up and unfastened the top button of my gray linen jacket. I leaned back against the stiff plastic cushion. The silence in the booth was incredibly thick, heavier than a physical punch. The waitress dropped a greasy paper check on the edge of the table and quickly walked away. The heavy scent of cheap corn syrup mixed violently with the sharp, stinging smell of ammonia floor cleaner. Frank cleared his throat. The dry scraping sound echoed in his mouth. I never made it past rank E5, he muttered. His eyes remained glued to his coffee mug. Got out, went back to the steel mill, spent my whole life as a greasy mechanic. He slowly looked up. The edges of his eyes were a bruised, burning red. The deep wrinkles at the corners of his eyes twitched violently. When you got your stars... He swallowed hard. I felt like I was suffocating. I panicked. I had to push you down. I had to make you a little paper pusher so I could still feel like the man of the house. The ugly, naked truth dropped right into the center of the sticky table. It was the pathetic, hollow jealousy of an old man desperately covered up by 2 decades of mental abuse. I placed both of my hands flat on the sticky laminate surface. The protective eardrum of his lies had just been punctured. I did not need to play defense anymore. Overseas, I negotiated directly with the worst hostile threats in the world, but right here in this diner, I was forced to negotiate with my own father just to eat a meal without being insulted. I have 4 stars yelling at me every single day in DC. I said, my voice completely flat, stripped of any leftover sadness. I looked directly into his red eyes. I don't need another boss. I needed a father, someone who occasionally called just to ask if I ate dinner instead of interrogating me about how much money I wired to keep your house. Sitting next to me, my mother finally stopped running the plastic rosary beads through her fingers. She nervously slid a chipped porcelain plate into the middle of the table. A large portion of crinkle-cut French fries buried under a thick, melting layer of yellow cheddar cheese and greasy bacon bits. The exact junk food I used to beg for when I was a kid in Chicago. Frank reached his shaking arm out. His calloused, dirt-stained fingers grabbed a single crinkle-cut fry dripping with hot yellow cheese. He held it out across the table toward me. "Eat, kid," he whispered hoarsely. I'm sorry about the burnt patty this afternoon." I looked down at the greasy potato. It represented the absolute peak of clumsy, raw, blue-collar apologies. No crying hugs, no empty poetic speeches about forgiveness. I leaned forward. I pinched the fry between my thumb and index finger, pulling it from his hand. I bit it in half. The sharp salt and the heavy, cheap fat coated the back of my dry throat. We sat there, eating the greasy food in absolute silence. The war was officially over on top of a sticky, laminate table. But as I chewed, staring out the dark diner window, I wondered if this fragile piece would survive the sunrise, or if Frank would find a brand new mask to wear at the airport tomorrow morning. The drop-off lane at Terminal 2 of the San Diego airport was thick with the heavy, choking smell of jet fuel and burning rubber. The morning air was freezing. I pulled the parking brake of the rental Ford and hit the button to pop the trunk. My mother kept her head down. She silently grabbed her cheap souvenir bags and shuffled away without a single word. Connor gave me one very quick, stiff nod before grabbing 2 massive suitcases heading straight for the sliding glass doors. Frank stepped out of the passenger side. He was not wearing his frayed, grease-stained flannel shirt. He had put on a brand new, perfectly ironed navy blue cotton t-shirt. Stamped clearly across his left chest in crisp, white letters was a single sentence, "Proud father of a Navy Rear Admiral." He did not point to the shirt. He did not say a single loud bragging word about it. He just wore it like a silent, desperate billboard of apology, pinned directly to his own chest. I leaned my hip against the heavy metal door of the truck. Usually, this was the exact moment Frank would toss a half-hearted insult or offer a weak, pathetic hug, just to pretend we were a normal family. But today, Frankie Perry stopped exactly 3 paces away from me. Rushing travelers dragging rolling suitcases hurried past us on the concrete sidewalk. Frank brought his feet together. His heavy boots hit each other with a sharp, crisp clack. He straightened his back completely, shedding the hunched, broken posture of an old Chicago mechanic. He raised his right arm. His fingers were perfectly flat, snapping sharply against the edge of his eyebrow. He did not look at me like a daughter he had spent 20 years trying to erase. His wrinkled, bloodshot eyes looked straight ahead, staring directly at me with the absolute submission of a low-level sergeant facing his highest authority. "Goodbye, Admiral," Frank said, his deep voice cracked, breaking apart completely on the final syllable. A single heavy tear leaked out of the corner of his wrinkled eye. He did not blink. He held the salute. I stood up straight, pushing my weight off the heavy door. I raised my right arm, bending my elbow at a perfect, sharp angle. A cold, mechanical motion. I returned the salute. "Take care of yourself, Sergeant," I said quietly. Frank gave one sharp nod. He held his position for exactly 1 more second, then dropped his arm rigidly to his side. He turned on his heels. He walked straight through the automatic glass doors of the terminal. He never looked back. I knew he was sobbing, and the absolute last shred of pride left in an old mechanic would not allow him to let me see that weakness. I slammed the heavy truck door shut. I jammed the gear shift into drive and slammed my foot on the gas, merging aggressively into the heavy traffic on the I-5 highway. In the rearview mirror, the airport terminal shrank down until it completely disappeared. On the center console, the black encrypted flip phone suddenly lit up. It vibrated violently against the hard plastic tray. I hit the green button. "Admiral," the duty officer's voice crackled through the secure line. "Satellites just picked up a code redshift over the Spratly Islands. The Joint Chiefs need you on a live feed in exactly 20 minutes. I glanced down at the cup holder. Sitting right next to my black coffee was my blue-bordered plastic ID card. There was still a faint, ugly smudge of dried mud right across my face. "I am 15 minutes from the front gates," I said, my voice completely flat and hollow. "Start the alpha sequence." I hung up the phone. I pressed the gas pedal all the way down to the floor mat. The engine roared. Real power never comes from screaming in a parking lot. Real power is the ability to endure the worst pain imaginable in absolute silence and knowing exactly when to drop the blade to end the whole thing. Thank you so much for walking through this journey with me. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever had to build a wall of silence just to survive the people who were supposed to protect you, please leave a comment and let me know. I read every single one. Thank you for your time, your empathy, and for subscribing to the channel. Stay strong, and I will see you in the next one.